Hey there and welcome back for lesson 2 in the online workshop. In the previous lesson, we've talked about the traditional method of market gardening and the implications it has on your profitability. We went over the reasons why that approach of growing vegetables is kind of outdated, and that with tilling the soil we are creating a lot of problems for ourselves as farmers. We will be constantly going against nature, which reflects back into having more weeds, needing more tools, and needing to put more work efforts into it. This means that you will need to invest more from the start, so you will end up with a much higher initial investment cost, but will also mean less profitability due to the extra labor it requires to manage such a farm. Not to mention what it does to your soil and ultimately the overall quality of your production. If you haven't watched the previous video, feel free to watch that one first before continuing with this one. Ultimately, from the tillage method, we can directly tap into 5 myths that are associated to this way of growing food. And these myths are going to cost you to invest more time, invest more money, and requires more energy inputs to run your farm. And with no further ado, let's jump right into the first myth. You need a lot of tools and equipment to manage the farm. To a certain extent, this is true if you go down the path of using tillage in your overall growing methods. The tools and equipment that are being used with this method are endless. You will need tarps, flame weeders, wheel hoes, a walk-behind tractor or a tilther or both, tine weeders and several other tools strictly for the management of weeds in a tilled market garden. And the costs for all of these tools combined are not the least. Just these tools combined can cost you over 10,000 euros or dollars. That is a huge amount of money that you need to invest before you even start growing. Imagine that you're already 10,000 down the hole, and what do you get in return? Extra work and more complexities. That's right, these tools are not miracle tools. They are tools specifically created and designed to help you with the weeding management on your farm. But does it help you address the root of the problem? No. You see, the whole reason weeds exist in an ecosystem is to help regenerate land after either a man-made or a natural occurring disruption of the soil. An example of a man-made disruption is tillage, and an example of a natural disruption can be a wildfire. Whenever a disruption occurs, nature's first response is to start the regeneration process. And this means a flush of, you've guessed it, your favorite weed seeds. They are both annual and perennial plants that they are really one of the toughest and most resilient plants alive on the planet. They are able to start growing in very poor conditions just with one goal in mind, to cover the soil and protect it from the elements. But imagine you use a method of growing food that doesn't create this disruption and instead focuses on working in harmony with nature. That method exists and it directly translates back into the amount of tools that you simply don't need for your farm. You can quite literally save yourself a huge initial investment cost that can reach numbers upwards of 10,000. And if you are able to do that, it will be much easier for you to start seeing success. Myth number 2. You need to cultivate because plants like loose soil. Probably coming from tractor and tiller manufacturers. You need to till and cultivate your soil to get a crumbly and loose topsoil, which is perfect for your vegetables. And the production on our farm simply proves otherwise. We don't cultivate the soil, yet our plants are growing extremely abundantly. And if we look deeper into why that is, it is pretty simple actually. The structure of our soil and the no-dig growing beds are home to a wide diversity of soil life that are being protected, stimulated and promoted. And they are constantly creating air and moisture channels. These channels and pathways are used by the roots of the plants to reach out for water, for nutrients and for oxygen. Without tillage, the soil will naturally be firm. This firmness, contrary to popular belief, is actually a good thing. It allows plants to anchor down into the soil and really hold on to it, providing stability. Now, I personally don't walk really on my beds, but if it happens, it actually feels similar to a sponge, like what it would feel like if you walk in a forest. It kind of bounces back. And this is a great illustration of something that you want to create, and shows that we are working with a soil that is alive, that is vibrant and full of organic matter. Forests, they don't require any tilling, yet they're one of the most abundant ecosystems on this planet. On our farm, we don't do any cultivation or tilling besides removing the occasional weed here and there with a precision weeder. And this undisturbed soil is providing us with plenty of healthy and abundant growth. Myth number 3 and 4, soil testing and the need for fertilizers. I decided to combine these two myths together since I believe they are closely related. This topic is an interesting one because it doesn't matter what book you open, in most of them there will be a section on soil testing and the importance of it. But is it really that important? Is a soil test really able to tell you what's in the soil and what's available to your plants? And based on these results, are you able to come up with a recipe to add anything to your soil that your soil might be lacking? To answer these questions, we need to look at what soil tests are and what they do. In general terms, a soil test is the analysis of a soil sample to determine the nutrient content available within the soil, the composition, and other characteristics like the acidity or the pH level. This test is oftentimes done by commercial laboratories that offer a wide variety of tests targeting groups of compounds and minerals like the major nutrients, the secondary nutrients, and the trace elements. Based off the tests that they do, they can then see the exact quantities of nutrients that are available in the soil, the pH level of the soil, and the exact composition. So what it's made out of, whether it's clay, loam, silt, sand, or a combination of these. And usually also the level of organic matter content. If you've ever sent a soil sample to a laboratory for testing, you've probably seen the values what your soil contains and the amount of each of the nutrients they recommend the soil should have. At first, if you wouldn't know any better, you would think that following their recommendations is the right thing to do. After all, they are the scientists and do these tests regularly, right? To answer this question, I'm going to refer to something Dr. Elaine Ingham said. If you don't know who that is, she is an American microbiologist and recognized as the foremost soil biologist in the world. She discovered the soil food web nearly 4 decades ago and has been pioneering research ever since. She literally said, "I don't know of any soil in the world that doesn't contain all the nutrients already. During my lifetime, the number of plant nutrients considered to be essential has increased from 3 to more than 40. Who can say what a plant needs except the plant itself? Applying this mineral or that fertilizer is also a waste of money. Assays of plant tissues reveal that nutrients present bear no relationship whatsoever to any soluble artificial nutrients applied. A plant requires all nutrients to a greater or lesser extent, and only it knows what it needs and when. The trick is having all those nutrients in a bioavailable form in the soil at all times." Looking at this, it puts literally everything into a different aspect when it comes to soil testing, because here on one side we've got pretty much everyone telling us to that it's important to do a soil test, yet the world's foremost soil biologist says it's a waste of money. Now, I'm personally not a soil biologist, and quite frankly, I'm not too interested in becoming one. But having a basic understanding of the soil and simply by observing the growth of your plants, you will be able to work your way around soil testing and fertilizers. I mean, do you really need to buy those expensive bags of fertilizers that mimic nature poorly and give the plants no chance but to force feed them with it? Or are you going to allow the plants to take up the nutrients when they require them? The choice is yours. But of course, if you have to believe the fertilizing companies, you obviously have no choice. And I'm here to tell you that after many seasons on this specific site, we have not once applied any fertilizer. Not for our so-called heavy feeders, nor for the light feeders. Yet we seem to be getting bumper crops every single growing season. And the only thing that we apply is compost. And this keeps the whole system protected, happy, and fed. But then the question might arise from, doesn't compost leach out nutrients in heavy rains or in irrigation? And the answer is no. Compost itself is not a fertilizer in the usual sense, as in nutrients necessary for a particular planting. The nutrients in fertilizers are mostly water soluble and readily available. In contrast, the nutrients within compost are kind of held in a water insoluble state until plants need to access them. On top of that, the compost also gets consumed and excreted by soil life, which converts them into an even more diverse range of food for plant roots. So to come back to the initial question and the myth, do you need to do a soil test and use plant fertilizers? The answer is no. Which brings us to the fifth myth, and that is crop rotation. Reading up on farming, you will inevitably end up stumbling on the topic of crop rotation. And much advice on the topic states of a necessity of a 4-year interval between crops of the same family. It basically comes down to a categorization of plants into groups or families to reduce diseases and make the most of the fertility that is available in the soil. And on a small farm, this is simply not practical, nor entirely necessary. That is, once again, if you don't till the soil, because if you do, crop rotation is probably going to be much more necessary. If we look at the traditional sense of crop rotation, we would pretty much have one crop in a bed, let's say cabbages, and follow it up with something like a cover crop that will have to be tilled in and made ready for planting again in the following season. By tilling in the cover crop into the soil, we are creating a subsoil compaction pan, whilst most of the tilled-in green manures will decompose in an anaerobic fashion that in turn favors the microorganisms in the soil that are actually harmful for plants. Since we are working on a small scale and do most of the work by hand, we're not only growing one succession in a bed, but usually at least 2 or 3, and in some cases even up to 6 successions in the same bed in one growing season. We can start out a bed with, for example, spinach, followed by carrots, by summer squash, followed by lettuce, and as last a crop of radish. Those are 5 different crops, and only the carrots and lettuces are from the same family, but they are broken down by the summer squash. And thus essentially we are already following an adapted approach to crop rotation. If we look at the traditional sense of crop rotations, most of the rotations are broken down in years, but on a small farm like ours, that is simply not viable and a big waste of time and space. On top of that, if you put all your efforts and energy into creating a healthy soil, the need for rotation becomes very small. And we've experienced this personally on our farm. We've been growing crops of the same family in the same beds without any noticeable problems. If we have to grow 2 crops of the same family in succession behind each other, meaning that we could potentially increase our production, I'm more than happy to do so. Having said that, I try to avoid it if I can. If you see that there's a crop that endures heavy pest infestations, so for example on our farm that would be with brassicas and flea beetles, it would be ignorant if we would try to grow those crops in succession behind each other. It wouldn't make much of a smart decision because we know that the possibility of that crop to be eaten and destroyed is very high. So in that case, we would plant a crop from a different family in that bed, of which we know that flea beetles, for example, are not attracted to. Approaching the rotation of crops in the market garden this way honestly has allowed for a much more simplified planning and crop management. You don't have to divide your crop rotation into years, and you can even grow some of the crops of the same family behind each other if you have to. The key about making this all work lays in the soil. Take care of the soil and the soil will take care of your plants. And with that, we've covered 5 myths that will cause you to lose more time, more money, and more energy into your farm. And these myths all come from using the traditional method of market gardening and growing food using tillage. But there is another way to all of this that allows you to reduce your workload, that will increase your profits, and will provide you with a much higher quality of life. And I'm looking forward to share that with you in the next lesson. Have a great day, and I will see you there.